it is exciting to be back talking about Easter is a way of life and trying a new sermon this morning with my good friend, Jeremy Scott. So good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning, Jim. This is going to be fun, I think. I like it.
First time for everything, right?
Absolutely. We're being bold and brave, right? That's what Jesus wants us to do.
That's right. Oh, very good. And our story this morning, as we pick up back in the Gospel of John, and we finish the story that we started last week, where the disciples were out in the lake. They were fishing in the Sea of Galilee. They see Jesus with the charcoal fire cooking them breakfast. They jump out of the boat. Peter jumps out of the boat, goes to shore. The disciples follow, and as breakfast is ending is where we pick up our story today. So breakfast is concluded. Jesus and Peter, we get this scene, are sitting around this charcoal fire and having a conversation. And I think it's important. There's a couple details in here that John really brings out in the midst of this conversation between Jesus and Peter that we don't want to miss. The charcoal fire being one of them. We hear a charcoal fire earlier in the Gospel of John when Peter denied following Jesus. And I think it's this is one of the details that is important for us to connect with, because what Jesus is doing here is connecting Peter back to his love of Christ, back to his first love, if you will, and that following that Peter did through these 3 years when Jesus first called him on the boat that we heard about last week as well. What's interesting to me is as Jesus is around this fire talking with Peter, Jesus doesn't chastise Peter. He doesn't say, "How dare you do what you did?" He asks him questions and helps him try to process some of his struggle through that time, through the denial. And in the question...
And that's a theme.
Oh, go ahead.
I always want to say, because that's a theme. That shows up in Thomas as well. Like, he doesn't chastise Thomas, right? Jesus is incredibly gracious in all of these moments. And this is just another example of Jesus being like really gracious with, these flawed people, but people that he knows and cares and loves. So I'm fascinated by that we tend to get fixated on doubting Thomas and denying Peter and all that sort of stuff, and we can miss just how utterly overwhelmingly gracious Jesus is being in all these moments. So I think it's not just here; it's a theme throughout. The post-resurrection Jesus is a pretty chill guy,
full of grace. Yeah, full of grace. So we see that in this moment. And, the very first question that Jesus poses, and yes, we'll talk about the answers and all of that. But the first question that Jesus poses is, "Do you love me more than these?" That more than these, drawing a connection back to when Jesus was visiting at the Last Supper, and they were all sitting around the table, and he says, "You will all desert me." And Peter's like, "No way, there's no way I'm going to desert you. I will give my life for you." And yet, a few hours later, Peter, standing around a charcoal fire, says, "Jesus, who? I don't know this guy. No, I'm not one of his followers. No, I wasn't there. You got the wrong person. I was framed." So Jesus, even in the very first part of his questioning of trying to get Peter to almost process the guilt that he might be feeling, again, not coming at it as a "why did you do this," but coming at it as this, Peter, think through what are you feeling? Why are you at this? You said one thing, and then a few hours later, you denied me. You did desert me. Come back to me. So do you love me more than these? drawing that connection to Peter, thinking that he was better than all the other disciples, right? But yet he still denied knowing and following Jesus. And of course, then, as you look at this story, you see the three questions: Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, yes. You know that I do. This is the third time. Yes, Jesus, are you hearing me? Yes, I love you. And Jesus isn't doing that for himself, right? Like, Jesus is doing that for Peter.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
To try and...
Yeah, because I feel like if you could almost act it out, that first time, Peter's like, it's like, do you love me? Yes. Feed my sheep. And he's like, oh, okay. Like, no. Let's try this again. Like, you don't get it. Like, Peter, do you love me? Like, yeah. And it's just like, and I think it also just speaks to a little bit, the one thing we know about Peter at this point is he's a little quick to talk, right? I mean, he's a little, his mouth gets ahead of him from time to time, and he's prone to say things without really thinking about them. And I think what Jesus is going for is he really wants Peter to think about this, like think about the implications of what it is that he's saying and asking in that moment is really important, because there's actually I'm glad you brought up there's a callback to the Last Supper moment when Peter's like, I will lay down my life for you, but that is also a bit of a callback to earlier in chapter 10 when Jesus first introduced this idea of shepherds and sheep, and he said, and that's when he introduced himself. He says, I am the shepherd, and the shepherd will lay down his life for his flock. The hired hand won't do that. So I think Peter's kind of going back to that moment when he says, he's basically taking on the mantle of shepherdhood, with Jesus, and at the Last Supper, Jesus is like, I don't think you quite get what that means, right? Like, I don't think you quite get that what all that entails. So now we have Jesus sort of, basically saying, I think, to Peter, like, okay, now's the time. Now you do need to become the shepherd. Like, I'm going. So now's the time that you do need to take on this role of shepherding, and I need you to understand, like, the entirety of what that means, right? The wholeness of what that means. And so I think that's why he has to keep repeating it just to get it through Peter's thick head, and I commiserate with Peter because I occasionally have a thick head myself.
Yeah, so as Peter is having this conversation with Jesus then, and Jesus is asking him the questions, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Do you love me? Jesus, you know that I love you. The feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Those are all the responses then, right? So the three of those, three denials, and we see the sort of the reconciling of that guilt of not saying, yes, I will never let you down, never deny you, and will go with you even to my death. And eventually, as church history goes, is that Peter did follow through with what he said, following Jesus and continuing the work that Christ started to his death, being crucified upside down. So this idea of what we're looking at here in these commands, we see sort of like what the heart is of Jesus as he is transitioning the church or the movement of Christianity into Peter's hands and indirectly into our hands as well, right? Like there is like this passing of Jesus asking Peter to model what the church is going to be and what the church is going to do.
Yeah. And I think you're, yes, I think that's so important about this part. And because really this is the moment that takes this from being frankly, like almost, I mean, I don't mean this necessarily in a derogatory way, but it's like there's almost like a cult of personality at this point, around Jesus. Like he is the person that everyone is centered around and the whole movement is centered around. But Jesus knows that it can't stay that way, right? Like it won't be able to grow. It won't take on the impact that God needs the movement to have if it's just people, 1 degree away, from Jesus all the time. And so he's basically himself kind of stepping back and handing off the movement to Peter and the other disciples, and then with the expectation that they're going to eventually do the same, right? That leadership isn't to be hoarded, in this, and that it is to be shared. And we're part of the call of following Jesus is not only living into our own call to be leaders in whatever capacity we do, but to also raise up other people.
So in this moment, in this passing of the baton, I always love that imagery, right, of a relay race, someone running around, coming up to the next person in line, and they run together. They make the exchange, and then the other person starts running while the other one stops and cheers them on. What has really stood out to me in this interaction between Peter and Jesus, typically we like to focus on, love, the love. Do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. Or we like to follow the language of feed, tend, and feed. Just the idea of to watch out for other people, to tend to other people's needs. We talk about the lamb and the sheep and the sheep. Very rarely do we ever talk about the pronoun that isn't between those words, the my. And as I was reading it this last time, that my really stood out because for me, I've always focused on those buzzwords because those buzzwords are important. The tending, the feeding, taking care of other people, demonstrating our love for God through our actions and deeds. But so often I forget that the people that I'm leading are not my sheep. I have been entrusted with Jesus's sheep, not my sheep, because that my there is connected to Christ, who is saying, feed my sheep. These are my sheep, and I am entrusting you with these people. So when we lead other people in service, when we lead other people in demonstrating loving grace and kindness and mercy, and are in ministry for other people, I think it's important that we remember that who we are tending to, who we are feeding, are not our sheep, but they're God's sheep. And so that, as I was reading it this time, I was like, oh, yes, this to me was like where it came alive of that. And it makes sense, right? Because we go back to what Jesus said before with the sheep and the goats, to whatever you do for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do for me. Like drawing that connection. These are my sheep. They're mine, and I want you to take care of them.
I really like that. Sorry, I'm processing that a little bit because I don't know that I've actually really keyed into that like you said, that pronoun or whatever it is, that's in there, and who things people belong to, and I think, in the context of, like, especially in the context of leadership, that's important, as we need to know, especially if we are in a position to where people have trusted us to be leaders, like who it is that we're leading. Because on the one hand, like, I feel a lot of connection and a lot of ownership, over my congregation and my church, and I call them my people, and I love them, and I'm exceedingly proud of them, and I like to brag on them all the time. But it's also reminding that they're not mine, right? I mean, the goal is not to create, disciples of Jeremy Scott, right? I mean, the goal is to create, disciples of Jesus Christ.
I almost, in a sense, feel like, boy, this is like a big mantle that is being passed, that God would entrust us with God's beloved ones.
Yeah. Oh, I am flabbergasted all the time with, I'm like, really? You want me to be responsible for this or these people or this, all of that? I'm like, surely somebody else would be better suited to do this work. But I think what you're hitting on there is this. I think it's just there's a bit of a human trait. I think that we look for, I think, complex solutions that are going to be easy to do. We want the really complicated medicine that just comes in a pill we can take, right? I mean, we want that sort of stuff versus the actually conceptually simple notions of what something needs to look like that take hard work and diligence, right? Because he's basically saying, I love what you're saying here, because he's basically saying leadership is easy. I mean, conceptually, leadership is easy. Care about the needs of those you're trying to lead. Make sure that they have everything they need to be successful. Tend to them, care to them, let them know they're loved, they're cared, and they're appreciated. I mean, these are very basic concepts. But lead us to have to do some hard and sometimes dirty work, of like Jesus did, of getting down on your knees and washing feet. Right? I mean you're not, no leader is above cleaning the bathroom. Is kind of, I think, one of the things that is if we're going to live into the example Jesus sets, where it's actually not hard to practice leadership. I mean, it's not conceptually hard to understand how Jesus wants us to practice leadership. It is difficult in that it demands time and energy and attention and care. And it requires you to put other people's needs ahead of your own, in a way that, if we're honest, a lot of the times we don't want to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that the ego gets in the way.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was doing this, when I was prepping for this, is I was thinking about, those times when it like dawned on me, that I was in a room with people and like, oh, wait a minute, I'm the one in charge, right? And you're just like, oh, like, that they're, and I feel like that's kind of the moment we're having here. So when it happens, it certainly happened in the church world, but I think it happens all over the place. And I remember in my first career as a software engineer, the first time, I was put in charge of a team. And at that point we used to go, I'm sure they don't do this anymore, we used to actually go and visit client sites and do the work on site on the client. And so I had a team of 6 people, and it was me, and I was told like a week before I was going to go be part of this team that I was actually going to go, but I was going to be the project lead, that I was going to be in charge of the team too. And make sure work gets done and all that sort of stuff. And I remember the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. But it turns out that this particular group of folks was a bit of they like to have a good time. And we're all young and, with expense accounts and, that kind of stuff. There's habits start to develop where we're probably going out to dinner and staying a little too long than we should, and, probably enjoying ourselves a little too more than we should. And in the morning, the time people were arriving at the office in the morning was slipping later and later and later and later, to the point that the client started to notice that, only half the team was there by the time they were all present, and like, where are my folks and everything. And then, finally somebody from the client comes and talks to me and says, it'd be really great if you all could be here at the same time, or at the same time we are, and so we can get started. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm like sitting there going, yeah, you're right. I don't know what's up with all these guys. And then he looks at me and he's like, well, aren't you in charge? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess I am. I will talk to them. And it was like, this is the moment, like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I am responsible for these people, and I'm responsible to help these people be successful. And I'm responsible, not just for my behavior, but for theirs, to some degree. And I'm like, oh, like somebody needs to talk to them. And I, at that point, like, oh, wait a minute, I'm somebody. Like that's my job now. I'm like, oh, and it was like, I still can remember I don't remember a lot about, 15 years ago when this happened, but I mean, I do remember that day, and I remember sitting in that chair thinking, like, we're going to have a meeting. I don't know. Like, I was like, how are we going to deal with this? I don't know, but we're like, something's going to need to happen here, so we can make that happen. So I was curious, Jim, have you had a moment like that where you're just like, where you just like have this sudden realization, and you're like, oh, somebody needs to be in charge here, and that person is me?
Yeah, for me, it was as a volleyball coach. So I went to a volleyball, like the coach's training as I was entering into that role. And at one point in the training, someone made the comment around, you can't yell at your girls, because I was coaching girls, you can't yell at your girls for not doing something that you have not trained them to do. It sounds so simple, right? But coaches have this challenge of thinking that the team represents them. And so if they're not playing well enough, if they're not winning, that somehow that is a reflection on the coach. So they put all this pressure on their team, when in reality, it's like, if you didn't teach them the way that you want them to play, they're not going to play that way, right? And so you can't stand on the sideline and yell at your team if you haven't done the work to teach them or train them to do what you're asking them to do. And in that moment, it was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, so when I heard that, I also thought back to one of the seminary quotes we were required to memorize in one of our classes, and our teacher, the quote from the teacher was, "You cannot lead people to a place that you are not willing to go to yourself," right? And so just that idea, or that concept of Jesus actually went to the places that he is asking us to go to. Are we willing to follow as his sheep and go there to then lead and love, care, and tend to the sheep that we're going to?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to hold on to, especially in this kind of post-Easter, this post-Easter season, is that's probably, one of the most important realities of the cross is, Jesus having to go as far as anyone should, could, or would ever be asked to go for another person. And his willingness to do it, to basically understand exactly what you said, is like, how far do we go in service to others? Well, Jesus sort of set the standard, of what that looks like. And so most of us will never be asked to come close to that level of sacrifice. But I also think that also puts the burden on us that when we are asked to sacrifice, even in small ways, it's not something, we should hide from, either. And I'm glad you had an example about coaching, because I think also the challenge when we have passages like this is we can think of, this idea of, biblical leadership and servant leadership, as something that, happens like within the church. And we hope it does. And I do hope that our churches sort of operate this way, but it's not limited to that. Like, this is how people of faith and followers of Christ should be living and leading, in whatever ways they can, whatever capacities they can. And you can lead in a very Christ-centered way, even, in a very, secular, non-religious, setting, whether that's, coaching or teaching, or, how you conduct your business, if you're a business owner, you work, how you, as an employee, how you conduct yourself. I think, Jesus, I think, cares about that. I think Jesus cares about how we conduct and how we lead and how we follow, in those spaces, every bit as much as Jesus cares about how we do those things in the church, and maybe even more so. So I think we can't limit this to either to just, what is leadership like within the church? Sure, it hopefully looks like this, but it's anywhere we have the chance to lead. So, well, it's been a fun.
That's right.
It's been a fun conversation, Jim.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too, Jeremy.
I like.
May we lead in service. Lead by service. Easter as a way of life. Leading by serving others.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Well, blessings, brother, and blessings.
Well, the glare is there.
It is what it is.